And yeah, this is going to be an interesting one. This is very much, we were kind of mysterious about the topic tonight because we wanted it to be a surprise, but this is going to be a more technique specific one than last time. But some really interesting, exciting stuff coming up. So yeah, I think this will be fun.
Yeah, that's one of those things that we think we want to get ahead of in terms of just getting out the right information about the stuff, and instead of having it sort of trickle down and sort of maybe the wrong information not get passed around on how to do this well. We're covering is quite hyper specific in terms of skill. We want to make sure that if people are going out there doing it well, and they're getting the facts right, the gear right, the setups right, and making the most of it. And also, I guess, protecting what we're after too is the fish. So we're all looking after the better benefit of everything here as well.
Yeah, cool. Well, it's right about 8, so I don't know if you just want to spill the beans right away or if you want to draw it out a little further.
Yeah, so I think maybe a bit of a preamble to it, and in terms of just talking about a little more about what we're seeing, what is being discussed and being done, and people experimenting with. So we've seen a bunch of posts recently about folks going out there with very, very light rods, very specific types of rods, and going out for steelhead. And a few years ago, I thought it's absolutely ludicrous and crazy to do what people are doing. It's not ethical, it's not right. But then we started to really dive into it and really get to the nitty gritty of how the rods work, what they're capable of doing. And what the rods are actually, how the rating works in a sense, and how it's not a typical fly rod rating, or it's named as a typical fly rod rating, but it's not actually the same thing as your conventional single hand rods. So to get into it, we're going to talk about Euronymphing with your standard trout rods for Euronymphing for steelhead, but purpose-built Euronymphing rods, not just your standard 7.63 weight. We're talking about purpose-built Euronymphing sticks. And there's a big, big, big difference. And we'll get into that and why that design matters, that principle matters, how the rods are designed. You can compare it to a few things too, so you have a bit of an understanding of how these things work. So when you pick up these 2 weights, probably not 2 weights, maybe more so 3 weights, maybe 4-weight Euronymphing rods, you understand that they're not a 3-weight, they're something else. So I think that's maybe a convoluted way of saying it, but hopefully it sort of demonstrates the point of what we're about to talk about. And why we want to get ahead of this and talk about this and get the right information out. If somebody does pick up their 7.63 weight and go out there for steelhead, or their 9'3" weight, there's a very good chance they're going to demolish that rod. It'll be in splinters pretty quickly. And the fight with the fish is going to be very unethical. It's not enough rod to actually fight those fish with. And we'll talk about the rod dynamics, how they're built. There's some comparisons of like a shorter 3-weight or a standard 3-weight versus a Euronymphing 3-weight. If you do hear any noise, that my dog Scout's behind me trying to get my attention. So bear with me. If he gets a little out of hand, I'll put him in his crate. We'll see how he does here. And he's also a little under the weather. He's flipping his bed around. So maybe you have to go put him in his crate. But Chris, take over. I'll be back in a quick second.
Sounds good. Well, evening, Marco. Yeah, so this is something relatively new to us. We've done a bit of tight line nymphing in the past, and we've addressed it very briefly in a shallow level. But yeah, we have seen it picking up, and like Rob's saying, we at the shop have been playing around with it this year and been seeing some pretty honestly insane results with it from a production standpoint, and really not having really any of the issues that we thought that we were going to be seeing with this stuff. So I think, judging by looking at the viewership here and the names popping up, most people probably have a bit of an understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about Euronymphing or tight line nymphing. But yeah, I don't know, Rob, I think it'd probably be a good idea to kind of do a quick recap. Again, not super deep, just about kind of what the whole thing is, since there's going to be a lot of folks joining in here who are, maybe more steelheaders, less trout anglers, maybe not super familiar with the whole concept.
Concept of Euronymphing.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, a bit of history on Euronymphing, just to touch on it quickly. We're not going to go too deep because it can get pretty nerdy, quite specific, bringing a whole bunch of, I guess, European influences. But Euronymphing is European style nymphing. It's broken down into a ton of types of French nymphing, Polish nymphing. You name it, there's a style specific to a region that was popularized and can be quite effective. Now, what it is using very hyper technical rods to very technically pick apart water and present the fly in a very, very accurate and very sensitive way for takes. The control is extremely good, and then you're able to pick up on the slightest takes, with indicator fishing, with center pinning, with float systems. there's such a huge margin for that fish to grab a fly and spit it out that this way of fishing is hypersensitive. I keep using the word hyper because it really is. And you end up hitting or feeling all those strikes. You see the strikes with your indicator tippet, and your catch rates, I would say, do go up astronomically. I think that's not hard to say.
The conservative way of putting it.
It is, yeah. But there's actually another point of caution with this too, is that no matter how good, so I'll just jump to that for a quick second so I don't forget it, but no matter how good your catch release practice is, no matter how you fight a fish and quickly bring it in, there's always going to be a mortality rate associated with fishing. So as your catch rates go up, the percentage of mortality stays the same, but the numbers of fish that you might injure or succumb to a technique, or say your fish catching might go up. So be very cognizant. You know, if you're going out there having a banner day of fishing, you're probably having an impact on those fish. So very important to say. And let's jump back into what I was talking about. And so I think when I really heard about Euronymphing was back when I was working at a fly shop in Toronto a bunch of years ago, and it was kind of like people talking about it, like, what is this thing? Like, how's it done? People picking up odd rods. You know, I think my first rod was a 10-foot 3-weight. It was a great stick for the time. It's still like a really fun stick to fish. But things have come a long, long way since then. And people were kind of figuring out what to do. Do we use, which kind of line do we use? Long leaders? Do we use Maxima? Do we use this? But really things have come such an incredible way in terms of technology and leader formulas and ideas behind it, and really picking up low notes from conventional angling as well, in terms of line diameters and sink rates and all those sort of things. So maybe a bit of a convoluted way. Maybe Chris, you're better at actually explaining what that was.
I think the simplest way to kind of put Euronymphing is, you know, take everything that you can of the equation and just drop it down to the most bare bones system that you can. And in that process, you end up with a more versatile, a more sensitive, more accurate setup. So basically, Euronymphing, tightline nymphing, Czech nymphing, Spanish nymphing, whatever you want to call it, is essentially a straight line connection from your rod to the fly. There's no split shot involved. Your weight is all contained within the fly, and you control the depth and speed of your fly using the positioning of your rod. So if you imagine you have a very direct line to your fly, there's nothing in between with an indicator or a float. You end up you have a connection to your float, but then it's a trailing piece of line to your fly ultimately. And so there's a chance to miss things there. Whereas you can imagine if you're tethered straight to your fly, you're going to have a lot more control over it and really be able to feel what's going on and have a much quicker reaction to any sort of take or thing like that as well. So that's a very simple way of putting it. Like Rob's saying, you can get very nerdy about the techniques themselves and the setups and all that. But that's the basic concept, is that we're just sort of, you know, reducing things to their bare bones sort of principles and going with an ultralight setup direct to our nice campfire, Winston, directly to our to our fly there. So the setups are typically, like Rob says, very light. Typically, there's no fly line or a very light fly line in the equation, and you're just fishing straight to a fly. There's a 1,000,001 videos on Euronymphing out there. We won't harp on it too much because it has been beat to death, although for good reason, over the last number of years. So I think most people are familiar, or if they're not, there's certainly resources out there, and we certainly at the shop can dive into greater detail with you. But it has been historically really just a trout, maybe grayling, you know, barbel and other coarse fish species kind of practice. And so steelhead, I think we're still sort of in its infancy, and so what we're seeing, maybe this is best equated to center pinning in the 80s or 90s. And I'm sure, you know, down the line from here, we're going to see a lot more advancements in maybe how we approach this. But yeah, it's taken off pretty quick around here. You know, I don't think I heard about more than 2 or 3 guys doing this as of last year, and this year it's you know, including ourselves, certainly picked up some steam. So with that, Rob, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. We could probably dive into the technique a little more.
For sure, there's a couple of things coming up beyond this presentation. Is that there are a couple of tires coming up that I think you want to watch if you're into this or want to get into it or have more information. That's Clint. He's coming up next week on that's the 17th. He's a phenomenal angler. When I met him, I had no idea who Clint was. We're competing at nationals in the fly fishing, and he was next to my truck. We're dropping around. So yeah, I'm going to win this one, kind of boasting. It turns out that he's absolutely one of the top competitors in the world. He's quite good. So I'd say he's a phenomenal resource. check out the presentation with Ian Troop talking about European style steelheading nymphs as well. That's coming up in early December, so don't miss that one either. If you've ever experienced Ian's talks, he's phenomenal. He's often, we're so lucky to have him as a resource, as a friend as well. When Chris and I fish with him, we kind of feel a little humbled next to his presence. So I would say it's worthwhile. And in terms of if you're looking for this presentation as a general steelhead topic, this is going to be hyper specific to Great Lakes steelheading and Euronymphing for them. If you're looking for general information, we have like a 2.5-hour general steelhead talk on our YouTube channel. The same sort of format, so go check it out there. We talk about how to predict water flows or fish runs with water flows, timing runs, where to find fish, all those things. If you want to get a general base of steelheading information, that's where you want to check out. Maybe not this one first, we'll go check that one out and then come back to this one.
Cool. All right. So if you want to talk about the gear a little bit, so in the past, like I said, we've done this a bit with more traditional steelhead rods, 10'7" weights and the like. The big revolution, really, what we're talking about is not even so much the technique, but the gear that we're using. That's really going to be the game changer for you guys. To give you a sense, we've been seeing like numbers of double-digit producing days on this technique this fall. It's really been just leaps and bounds versus your traditional steelhead gear. Well, a 10'7" weight is still a really versatile steelhead rod. What's really going to make this all click for you more than anything else, more than the flies, more than the leaders or anything else, is the rod. And so that's where we're going to get into, I think, first. I think that makes good sense to start with. This is my personal rod. This is my, which way is the right way? That way. My Contact 10-foot 8-inch 3-weight. Not that you have to use this rod, but I do love it.
There are great rods out there too. If you look at that, that's at the very top in the market. There's the Echo Shadow X, which I've been fishing, which is phenomenal too. Maybe about half the price, just over half the price. There's also the Echo Carbon XL, the Euronymphing rod. That's a way cheaper price too. So I don't think you have to go super high end. Lots of options when you do look for a Euronymphing rod as well as a touching point too. You don't have to go and break the bank.
Yeah, what's important is more the characteristics of the rod. So we actually did a little breakdown on our YouTube channel if you want to recap what we really look for when we're buying a Euro rod. But at the end of the day, most Euro rods will do this no problem. As Rob mentioned, maybe you want to look slightly more on the heavy-ish side of Euro rods, which means 3, maybe 4 weight. I think 3 is still your bread and butter. And then any length from, call it 10 feet to 11 feet will work just fine. Rob mentioned a little bit earlier, there's a key difference. I mean, there's a lot of key differences between these rods and your standard 3 weights. And so I think I said in some posts about this talk earlier that we're going to ruffle some feathers tonight. And I suspect that will be the case. I think that there'll be some people who are going to be caught off guard and already have been about what we've already said. And the big part about that is the fact that we're recommending fishing a 3 weight for steelhead, which is weird, frankly. Sounds weird to say. And I feel like without a little more clarification, we'll get some pushback on this one. The key difference is that this is not a 3 weight. So Euro rods, if you think of the setup that we're fishing, as I mentioned, we're not really using fly line. It's oftentimes a very long leader, direct monofilament to our flies. And so the old weighting system for fly rods is designed to balance the weight of line that you cast to the weight that the rod requires to load and cast. And so that's where 3 weight, 5 weight, and so on comes from. But with a Euro rod, because we're not casting fly line, we're casting the weight of the flies themselves, those ratings are kind of out the window. And so they're they give you a rough idea of the amount of power a rod has, but they're not completely accurate. And the reason that we're able to land so many, high teens, 20-inch plus range resonant tread on these rods is the same reason that we're able to do steelhead with them, which is that this is a really heavy blank toward the butt section. I can't really show you the whole rod here because it's a tiny screen. But if you look at this butt, this is not a 3 weight butt. And it's tough to see without comparison, which is why this is a standard 7.6 3 weight Echo Carbon XL next to it. And not sure how well that comes through. Can you see that clearly, Rob?
Yep, that shows it pretty well. I think
the top one here is your traditional 3 weight. Bottom one is your Euro rod. You can see that's a good bit thicker. That's, if I had to guess, it's probably 50% thicker on the butt end of your Euro rods compared to your traditional rods, which means that if you can play a fish off the butt end of your Euro rod, this is going to fight like a 6 or maybe not 7, but a solid 6 weight rod. This has a lot of fighting power on the butt end here. If you know how to, and this is the key word, if you know how to play a fish using the middle and bottom end of your rod, this thing can pull a fish around pretty well. And I will say, you're going to get your butt kicked by a few fish here and there still, but you're going to land a lot more fish, or you're going to hook a lot more fish, I should say. And the trade-off in my mind is well worth it. So that's really the biggest key difference as to why this will work and why your regular 3-weight will not work. Bottom line though, you still need to know how to play a fish. So there's going to be a lot of, I think, warnings and things along those lines that we're going to throw in here just to be on the safe end of clarity for everybody, so we're not getting a lot of complaints about broken rods and things. You can break one of these rods on a steelhead. People will break them. We will probably break them at some point on a fish here or there, whether it be by mistake or just because, you know, these are huge fish on light rods. But it is possible if you know how to play them. If you're just starting out, you want to avoid these things. If this is your first season, maybe not even steelheading, but thinking more just your fish fighting experience in your career overall, if you don't have a lot of experience fighting larger fish, you probably want to ease into this a little bit more easily. If you've been landing, you know, big fish on Eurogear for a long time, or on light tippet with dry flies, you know, you probably have a little more idea of how to do this, or even saltwater fish, because a lot of time we need to do these techniques there too. But if you're just starting off, I would stick with your more standard middle of the road gear. Anything you want to add to that, Rob?
Yeah, there's a song lyric that comes to mind. It's no one to hold them and no one to feed them. That's one of the, I think, classic things. I sort of a motto in my life. And when it comes to this and what we're doing, you have to know when to give up the fight and let the fish go. Because if you don't play the fish well, if you don't understand how to fight a fish on the lighter rod using the back end of the rod, the midsection, and you try to play it off the tip, and you're playing this thing out and literally to death, you will kill the fish. Fish aren't meant to be fought to a complete exhaustion. If a fish comes in on its side and it's done, it's not moving, that fish has a very low chance of recovery. So you want to do the best thing you can and bring the fish in. If you get to a point in your fight where you're thinking, this is getting a little long, and you get that little thing in the back of your head, like, this is taking a long time. Well, it has. So at that point, I would say just straight line your rod to the fish, point your rod at the fish, grab onto your line and walk backwards, get that line tight and give it a good pop and let the fish go. If you're fishing barbless hooks, which we recommend, that we've been doing this with barbless hooks too, and these rods actually hold barbless hooks much better than a standard, say, 10-foot 7-weight steelheading type rod. They're meant to hold barbless flies in the mouth. That shock absorbency and the play back and forth with the rod really helps that hook stay in place. So if you do get to a point where you feel like you are, and it's even just that little thought in the back of your mind, that's about time to break that fish off, and you'll catch another one. It's quite effective. There's that. In terms of also comparing, understanding rod ratings as well, is already a great example within a fly fishing of fly rods, and that's in the spay fishing category, and switch rods, where a 7-weight spay rod is not a 7-weight single hand rod, and they're not, that's the same thing whatsoever. There are a lot of things that we can blame on the fly fishing industry, and this is a fantastic one because they've chosen to use the same rating system for different things, which convolutes everything. So in terms of what you are using here, so a great example, if you do buy a 7-weight switch rod, you should actually put a 9 or 10-weight single hand line on that rod to get it to cast well. So you're actually essentially casting a 10-weight rod, not a 7-weight single hand rod. So there's already a scale in there that you can reference about how things don't line up exactly. So the 3-weight Euronymphing rod, more like a 6-weight in terms of fighting power, versus the I guess the 7-weight spay rod more like or switch rod more like a 10-weight, because that's comparison's already built into this thing as well. So a bit to get around because those rating systems sound so similar, but they're really not. It's frustrating, and we tackle this on a daily basis, talking about spay rods and light rods, and it compounds confusion on this stuff. So a bit of clarity on that and how it already exists in there as well. In terms of even getting ready to do this, and it sounds we're talking about pretty big, but it is a big deal because it is a hyper technical thing that we're about to do, or you're about to do. So I call it off-season steelhead training, where you are fishing for resident trout, say on the Grand or the Credit or other rivers, and you get a hold of the technique. You get a hold of how to fight some of those bigger fish as well, and then you train up to the steelhead and those bigger fish. Because if you don't go out there with a technical background or a confident background in this, it's not going to be very good for you. Even if how you hold your rod, how you position your rod, how you pull back on your rod. I can guarantee as people start doing this more, we're going to see a ton of broken rods, and people are not going to understand why they broke because they've been cranking back on rods. There's a huge belly and bow into it. Things flex beyond belief, and it's going to snap. So knowing how to how to stop that or not do it, or play the fish off of different parts of the rod is quite critical. And use your reel. Your reel is such a huge part of this too. Having a smooth drag, a very smooth drag, and just knowing how to use the whole system together.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, if we want to talk about a little bit how you got to think about sort of fighting these fish, is you've got an awesome tool for the job now with the rod. And Rob makes a very good point. Don't expect to just strip these fish in. You will not be able to control them. Pretty well every fish is going to end up being fought off the reel in this case. These aren't resident trout anymore. But there are a few things that you can really do to kind of put things to your advantage. Now you have an appropriate tool for this. And yeah, realize that there are limits to rods, like they can only do so much. But biggest thing is to really focus on side pressure when it comes to these rods. So, you see a lot of anglers, when they're fighting a fish, they'll have the rod up in the air. That does nothing to a fish. It pulls their nose a little bit upwards. It doesn't direct them at all. The reason that we're able to fight fish of any species and land them is because fish steer with their head. Whichever way their head is pointing is the way that they swim. And so if you don't control their head, you have no way of landing the fish. So the way that we do is with side pressure. And I see a lot of anglers as well, like they think, okay, I don't want to be fighting a fish vertical. I want to fight it on the side. This is not side pressure either, especially the further away that the fish gets from you, the less of that angle actually factors in, because at, call it 50, 70 feet away from you, which these fish will get to, this is the same as this. This means nothing. So two factors that I would focus on first, once you've managed to hook one of these things, is get the rod real low. I mean horizontal or even a little down. Fight it upstream of yourself, so rod tip upstream of yourself, and try and minimize the distance between you and the fish to maximize that angle. Once you get that angle on the fish, then you're actually able to steer its head and to turn it. You'll be amazed once you actually manage to steer a fish, how easily you're able to move it and get to do with what you want. The other thing that I would mention when it comes to fighting that can be really handy, has been a lifesaver for me on a few fish, is if a fish does get downstream of you, first off, don't be afraid to chase it. But you're going to need to hold your ground a little bit at some point. It's a really good tip I actually got from a good friend of ours who center pins a lot, works great doing that, but works really well doing this too, is if fish gets downstream of you, don't be afraid to plant your rod tip down in the water with a bend in your rod and just reel. Get the rod tip and your whole line sunk below the water. The drag over your line will actually make it harder for that fish to run downstream of you. And if you just put the rod in, don't pump the rod, just keep reeling at a steady pace. It's weird, it almost puts the fish into a daze, it seems, and you just sort of draw it up toward you. You can do that in actually fairly heavy water and drag it toward yourself. If those two techniques don't work for you and the fish is just kicking your butt, like Rob says, it's probably just time to cut your losses and bust off a fly, and the fish will spit it out later. But yeah, you really got to focus on your angles with these fish. And again, why it's important to practice with your other gear first. I would say, yeah, if you want to start off kind of mucking about with this, just to increase your confidence level, take your 10'7" weight or whatever you have now, throw on a heap of split shot, maybe some tungsten head nymphs, play around with the same kind of setup and use what would be considered relatively light line, call it 3X on a 7 weight, to get a feel for things. Just because the 7 weight's not as forgiving, you're going to go a little heavier on that than you would with the Euro setup. But catch a few fish doing that, really get a feel for managing the tippet and try some of those techniques, and maybe it's time to move on. Shelly asks, at what point do you change the side pressure to land the fish? You don't necessarily really need to, as long as it's constantly being steered toward yourself. If it starts bolting away from you, if it takes off, goes upstream, maybe it's time to change. But otherwise, just bring it straight to you, and frankly, don't be afraid to kind of just give it pressure. The great thing about these rods is that they're giant shock absorbers. If anyone's fished much center pin fishing in their lives, you might remember old sort of noodle rods. And it's amazing, if you really load them up and just kind of, play to the rods and to that lower butt power ability, you can bring them in pretty well. Good question from Shelley. Can you land a fish yourself with side pressure? I think that's the next point of gear that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so one of these things I think is one of the most useful tools you can have is bring a net with you on the water. Having that rod and those lighter blanks, you can't really, I guess they can't send as much abuse as maybe a thicker blank, more graphite. So you can't really come back with that bigger flex in there, and then it's more vulnerable at that point too. So having a net is a great thing to have. A very long handled net's going to be great for picking those fish up. Even this is kind of short, to be honest. The best thing to have, your next piece of gear, is a fishing buddy. So bring them along, bribe them, buy some coffee or something, pay for the gas, get them out there, and they will help you land those fish. Chris was very helpful landing one of my fish the other day, and then also a friend, Dan, as well. He netted a fish for me too. I will admit this, I broke Chris's rod. Stepping on it on video. It was the most hilarious thing because the
only rod we've broken so far doing this.
Yeah, and it was my fault and under my boot, but the snap of the rod in the video was hilarious. Like, it's really clear. Snap. Sorry, Chris. Public apology. Yeah.
Yeah. All good. But yeah, the net, I find I've done a few solo trips with this. This sort of the sketchiest part about this whole thing is the final few seconds of the fight, just landing it. Because if you imagine, once you get the fish in, that's when the rod really hooks over and bends pretty sharply toward the tip. And one badly timed head shake from a fish, I guess well timed in its case, it can do some damage to a rod, potentially break it.
Yeah, and if you have anything that's happened to your rod, if you have a micro fracture, if you have a ding, a scrape, anything that compromises the blank itself, at that point, when it's going to reach those maximum stress points, that's when you're going to see a failure take place. And it may seem like your rod's just breaking on its own, but something has gone to a point. The graphite's amazing. It'll flex, it'll stop flexing. That's its max amount. It can hold there for a bit, but then it will shatter and break. And a small, tiny microfracture, a ding, a tungsten bead hitting your rod, or a nymph or a streamer hitting your rod can do enough damage to cause that rod to break on its own down the road too. So be very
even if you don't hit it with the bead head fly, you can definitely blow up a rod doing that, for sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the net's good just because it allows you to land the fish a little further away from yourself. So if you can imagine, the bend doesn't have to be as steep. If I had to have that much bend in my rod to get to hand, I can maybe have that much bend getting it to the net, if that makes sense. And if you have a friend, all the better, because it can be even further out. You can keep a pretty minimal bend in the rod while they net the fish. So I would say net is really critical. Obviously, as we always talk about, just for fish safety, so that they aren't getting injured, beaching them, anything like that. That's very harmful. But also just to protect your own gear. I think that's and to again maximize landed fish too. That's if you're fishing light tippet, that's also the sketchiest time for landing them. That's when you'll probably break off most fish, is just that last couple seconds when you're really trying to seal the deal. So yeah, net really helps for sure. What else we're going to talk about? We'll talk about leaders and rods and stuff. Just trying to remind myself if there was anything big that we were talking about here. I don't think so. I think that was it on the big pieces of gear. So as Rob says, good reel is pretty key. You're going to play, like, say, every fish off the reel, essentially. So you want something with smooth drag, ideally, something fairly quick pickup, just so you can, get a good control and keep tension on these fish. I fish the Sage GSN. At the end of the day, this is an awesome reel, but a lot of different reels will do the job. It's something relatively smoother than large arbor would be preferable.
Yeah, people go Ion XL, that's going to work. Like, don't you have to go out there and once again spend big on these things. Like, what you have, just make sure the drag, it's not a click and pull. That's going to be a big thing. Get a mechanical drag that's going to work for you versus you having to control something else and pound and run around. That's one of the biggest things, is get the gear with the technological advancements. That's going to help you. I love old school gear. It's fun as heck. But when it comes to this stuff, like, get the gear that's going to help you land these fish.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking about lines a little, this is, again, sort of one of your key moments or key things that's going to really impact, how well you fish, how well this technique works for you, is the leader. So as I alluded to off the top, the simpler that you can make the setup for yourself and the lighter, the better. And this goes for resident trout as well as steelhead. So there's 1,000,001 different leader formulas out there. You can use whatever you're comfortable with. Some folks find tapered leaders, steps down of maximum things, easier to cast. I like level leaders, or very, very light leaders at least, just because they give me a very direct connection. So you probably barely see that. But this is the Rio indicator tippet. This is why I run. This is 4X. Depending on where you're fishing, you may want to mix this up a bit. So, you can get this stuff anywhere from 1X to 6X. I wouldn't go any lighter than 4 for steelhead. But so we've been fishing a lot of small-ish to mid-sized rivers with this technique. This is very appropriate for them. If I was to fish, say, Saugeen, even the Credit, if the water was up a little bit, where a fish, might have the potential to run a little more on you, you got to hold it back against heavier currents, you might bump it up a little to give yourself more room to fish heavier tippets. Basically, as with any leader, you want your leader to be heavier than your tippet. So if you break off, you only lose your tippet. So 4X would be on the light side, admittedly. I think 2X, 3X is probably pretty appropriate for folks. My leader setup is uber simple. Rob has a slightly different one, but I fish straight indicator tippet from my Euronymphing line to my ultimate tippet. So I run about 20 feet of this, call it, straight level tippet, and onto that add my tippet, in most cases 4X, maybe even 5X if the water's clear for this technique. If you want to show what you've got there, Rob, that's another really good option that people might be interested for a plug and play.
Yeah, it's very simple. Very similar to Chris's. I've mucked around with every system possible, building taper leaders out with different diameters of maxima. I'm really just going towards a long piece of cider material onto my Euronymphing line, and then tippet ring, and then my tippet itself. To give you an idea of what the Euronymphing lines do look like, and these are strong enough for steelhead. The core strength on these is more than enough. It's a very, very thin fly line, and the reason we have these actually came from competitive fishing, to have the thinnest legal diameter of line possible. But what these allow you to do is have great feel and handling on your fly line. I was fishing mono for a long time, and it would always slack out. It wouldn't work very well. It was hard to grip sometimes too. These have really positive traction on these, so it's better to grip. There's very, very tiny loops on these on the very front compared to a standard fly line, and they're a little more malleable too, so they fly through your guides a lot easier. So these things are super handy. So off of this, I'll put on a ton, I guess, depends on what I'm doing. I'm not competitively fishing, and there's actually rules within the competitive fishing about how long your leader can be, but you could have a 30-foot piece of leader cider on top of this, or a 15-foot or 20-foot, depending on what you want to do with it. Then down to 4X cider material, and then off there 4X tippet material, or 4.5X. It's pretty cool that Rio has come out following a few companies with like half X values, which is pretty darn cool. But yeah, 4X has been great for me, 4.5X. And then 5X for me, I'm kind of hesitant to use, but I'm sure it'll take it. It'll be all right if you get down to that level. I'm confident with that. I was gonna say, yeah, there's this one, there's a standard Euronym shorty, and there's also the technical shorty as well, which is a built-in piece of mono at the very front. Pretty cool thing there with the built-in tippet ring. I actually would probably prefer to stick with a standard full Euronymphing line. If you do get a fish that absolutely rips away from you, what's not going to happen if you use a full line is you're not going to have the back end of this kind of come through your guides and a really thick junction go up through your guides too, and then snag some more, hang up and break off. So those full lines are very, very useful. Actually, to be quite honest, I was kind of off those lines for a while, went to mono, and I've really sort of fallen back into using these things, or the full lines. They're freaking fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, glad you mentioned that, because that was the point I was going to make, is that, most fish are going to get past your leader. And so, not having a second, loop-to-loop connection, or one, depending on the connection you use, going through your guides is huge, so you don't have that rickety bump going up and potentially giving you a chance to break off. The shorty is a cool option. I would say, if you just want to kind of play around with this on a sort of a trial basis, say with your 7-weight or whatever, the shorty's cool. If anyone's not familiar, it's just like a 20-foot piece of Euronymphing fly line that loops onto your existing fly line, and they tie leader on that. So it's this, again, it's uber thin fly line. And it's a good sort of carryover option. but yeah, not having the junction going through is very big. Personally, I actually prefer a nail knot or a micro loop connection, just because it's smoother going through the guides. Standard loop does work too, though. You can even just clinch knot if you're not worried about damaging the coating of the line, which you shouldn't be. You can even just clinch knot your sight or tippet to that loop, like you would if it was a hook eye, to make that a little smoother going through your guides. Yeah, that's basically it. And you can imagine, this is super light. The lighter the sight or tippet you feel comfortable going with, and this applies to your regular nymphing too, the more direct a line you're going to have to your flies. Sounds almost comical. This stuff can have measurable weight, but it really does. Every X value that you go up on your sighter or your leader, it will droop more. It'll sag more with the added weight. So the lighter you can go, the more feel you're going to have with your flies. So I like, I probably wouldn't go over 3X personally, as long as you have the proper rod to do it. If I was going to muck around with this on 7 weight, again, 2X, 1X, just so you can fish the heavier ultimate tippet ends, would be the way to go. And then down from this, yeah, you're going to drop down to your tippet. So I really like fluoro for any kind of nymphing, but especially for this. A lot of folks will still use nylon for regular Euronymphing because it's so thin that the density, the fact that it sinks in water versus nylon that floats, doesn't play into it as much. Fluorocarbon is still more durable, but some folks, feel they can get away with it with nylon. When you get into the thicker diameters, the thing though is that the density of this stuff becomes more noticeable, I think. So if you go with a nylon which floats in a 4X or a 5X, it'll actually considerably slow down the descent of your flies. Whereas if you go with fluorocarbon, it will help you get down, on top of that being more abrasion resistant too. So I really like fluoro. I will run, I've gone down to 5X to this point without too much issue, although in higher water I've had some fish that again have kicked my butt. 4X is much safer. Eric at the shop has even played around with a little bit of 6X in low water and some smaller creeks, and again, lost some fish, landed some fish. If the fish aren't terribly large, you might even be able to go uber light. That's really pushing things. 4 to 5X is probably more where you want to sit. We had a couple, I'll dive into more after this, but let's see, we have a couple questions.
Here, yeah.
Yeah, so answer Shelly's first because it was first. Are you supposed to handle the fly line or indicator line during casting? You can do either, and you will use either and both because you're going to fish at different ranges, right? So if you have a 20, 30-foot leader out there, there are going to be times when you only want to fish 15 feet away from yourself. So you're going to have to handle your indicator. But the great thing about Euro lines, and the reason I like them, is because they are just easier to handle in hand, especially the thing about steelhead that we're not used to when it comes to resident trout fishing is that it's cold out and our fingers get numb and you lose dexterity. And so I find handling a fly line, thin as it may be, is a lot easier. And you're also, because you have big fish at play that could zip out on you, if this stuff wraps in your finger, you're probably not going to cut yourself on it. You might break off the fish, but you're not going to cut yourself. Whereas if you have really thin mono in your hands, you could cut yourself. So I much prefer the Euro line if I can manage to handle that. But average distance that you fish from Marco, whatever you're comfortable with doing. The one downside to Euronymphing is that it does fall off effectiveness wise the further away from yourself that you get. Now, of course, that's true dry fly fishing, indicator fishing, streamer fishing, whatever kind of fishing you're doing, the closer you can get to your intended target, the better you have more control. But generally speaking, I mean, fishing further than 30 feet away from your rod tip with this setup or with any Euro setup is going to be fairly difficult. So call it, 40 feet rod inclusive away from yourself is getting on the far end. If you can keep it 20 feet, 25 feet, that's going to be a lot easier for you. Use a micro perfection loop, works much better. Yeah, micro perfection would be more for the leader. Oh yeah, you're talking in relation to tipper rings there, I see. Tapered leaders, Brian, yeah, so you can use tapered leaders as we say, but the taper does add a fair bit of weight. which causes sag and in turn slack in your setup. So you're not going to feel things as much, if that makes sense. So a lighter leader here, you're going to feel a lot more versus a saggy, heavy tapered leader that you're not going to feel much. So you can, tapered leaders are designed to transfer energy so our flies straighten, but because we're casting essentially pure weight in the form of our nymphs, the inertia of our nymphs flying through the air will straighten anyways. So the taper is less important in the cast here. Yeah, I think that covers the questions. Anything you wanted to mention when it comes to lines there, Rob?
Everyone's going to have a bit of a preference on what they do. So, you know,
Yeah.
muck around a bit, have some fun, and find out what system works. If the litmus test, if you're catching fish and it works well, that's going to work for you. If you do something different and you catch less fish, it's probably not the best system. So you'll sort of be able to develop things as you go. But get out there and try it out, have fun with it, and then sort of, you know, see if you can tweak things. Sometimes when you tweak things, it doesn't actually work better. So go back to the plan and then sort of, you know, try something different, talk to us and see how, you know, bounce ideas off us of what you want to do. So absolutely, you know, just go out there and try it. You know, we can talk about gear and technical things all day and how to do it, and that's great, but it's also a matter of going out there and trying it too, but with the right foundations and idea of how these things work together. So cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to go about this stuff, as has been proven over a number of years. But this is sort of what we landed on for how we like to go about things. Connections, they influence things, but they aren't as important as some of the other components that we've mentioned today. So as far as connections, do what you feel comfortable and confident with. I will, before I forget, because I will forget, mention one thing that was a really hard learned lesson for me. I was out last week, I guess, and having a really good day, a lot of fish to hand, was doing really well. And my landing percentage was pretty good. Had only lost a couple fish on the day and felt pretty good about that. And then toward the end of the day, had a fish, broke it off, had another fish, broke it off, and was retying my tippet again. And generally I just go blood knot to my tippet and have my blood knot break just as I was tightening it. I thought, okay, it's weird. I didn't think I tied that poorly. Tried it again, break, try a third time, break. And so what I realized, I tested my tippet, is that because these are nylon tippets, one of the reasons I love the Rio indicator tip is this. It has a lot of stretch to it. I don't know how much that is, maybe 15-20% stretch, which is great. But the thing is that the more times that you stretch nylon, it will eventually lose that elasticity and you will actually fully stretch it. And in the process, you actually thin it out and in turn weaken it. So what I figured would happen, because I had, not trying to brag, but hooked a pretty large number of fish that day, is I had actually straightened and stretched out my leader entirely. And so I had really weakened it. And that's why I figure I had broken off a few fish in a row, or at least that's the excuse I'm going with. So if you have a really great day and you have, or maybe a really big fish that really pulls hard, hopefully it's not a drawn out fight, but maybe it just pulls really hard for a little bit. You may want to consider, just test your leader, see how much stretch it still has. You'll be able to feel it. If your leader isn't stretching the same way as it was before, just swap out the leader. Could save yourself some fish there. So that was a hard learned lesson for me the other day.
Yeah, it's like the tippets, it's not cheap for these things, but they do last a long time. There's 30 yards on here, so don't be afraid to use it. And at exactly Chris's point,
yeah, up to 90 feet, that's 3 liters. That should last you a long time.
Exactly.
It's funny though, I've never had that happen trout fishing, just because the fish aren't that big and they aren't going to pull that hard, right? So I mean, I'll use probably those 3 liters for an entire season. Whereas this, is one day and the leader is just toast.
Yeah. Just also test your tippet on when it comes in as well. Like occasionally bring it back in, run your fingers over it if it's nicked at all, because using such light line, a small little nick in there compromises it dramatically. So give your fingers over there and pull out a new piece of tippet, tie on, and stash the piece away in a garbage can somewhere, and keep on going. So don't be afraid to change things up and refresh your tippet as you go.
Marco, it's a great question. We will get to that in just a sec, but first, there is something else that I realize I want to cover when it comes to tippets. Pay very close attention to the tippet that you're using. And what I mean by that is make sure that you're actually using what you think you're using. I wish I had an example here. I didn't think of bringing it, but don't just take the tensile strength for what it is. There's a lot of companies, they may rate them differently. Some may just pull on until it breaks. Others may tie knots with it until it breaks, whatever. But also some, I hate to say it, are just flat out wrong and not even remotely close. So I won't name any names here, but there are certain brands of tippet that I think it's common knowledge that people talk about being very strong, and very strong doesn't mean much when it's just not right. So there's some lines out there that may say that 6 pound, they're actually 12 or 15 pound line. They're just completely mislabeled. And so they give people the sense that they're very strong, but what you're giving up is they're very, very thick. So what you really, really want to pay attention to here is the diameter. Now, if your line has an X value, that's great, because that directly correlates to diameter. There's also, if you're buying a more generic line, say Drennan or some other brands, they'll often have a diameter written on them, and so those you can compare between brands. Your 5X here, people say, okay, it's 5.2 pounds. Okay, maybe I will name drop Drennan. If you buy Drennan, pay super close attention to the diameters. It is way off base when it comes to diameters versus tensile strength labeled. I was showing somebody this the other day. We compared an 8-pound Drennan, what would be fairly reasonable in around 3 or 4X in most brands, its diameter versus other brands. And what it stacked up to, say, an SA's lineup is about 16 or no, it's 14 pound in this stuff. And the diameter follows along with it. It's crazy thick. And the reason that I need to mention that is because people think diameter only influences what the fish see, if they see the line or not. I'm of the mind that once you get to these slightly heavier tippets, fish are going to see everything, but usually it doesn't matter. But what it does affect is how your fly sinks and how your fly behaves. So a lighter, thinner diameter tippet is going to allow your fly to drift more naturally. It's going to allow it to flow. If you imagine, think of a stiff tippet like a piece of wire. If you tie your fly into that to be really stiff and rigid and not move, versus onto a small like hair-like fiber or filament, it's going to flow and move more naturally. But what's really important is that smaller diameters cut through the water better. They have less resistance, less drag, and so they slice through the water and get down. And that's the real benefit to going with 4X, 5X. So be very careful about what tippet you're using. Make sure that it's really as thin as you think it is, because if it's not, you could really be suffering as a result.
Yeah, so be critical of your gear and check those things out. If you really want to get dialed into fly fishing or any fishing period, is be critical of what you're using. And we have a friend who's a supplier of ours who's taken out his micrometer actually and measured stuff to make sure it's actually what it says it is. And as Chris said, the Drennan is completely off in terms of what it states, in terms of pound strength for what it's listed there. It's not right. And that goes to everything, even tungsten beads, to be frank. If you're buying bulk cheap tungsten beads and it's bargain prices, well, how much tungsten are actually in those beads? So there's a lot of things to be critical of, and look at those things when you're tying flies or picking leader material, rods, reels, things like that. If it's too good to be true, then it is too good to be true, type of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. The reality is that so for an equivalent diameter fluorocarbon, regardless of brand, the breaking strength is going to be within a relatively narrow range. You can't have, at least as far as our technology goes, to my understanding, a comparable size diameter tippet that's miles and leaps and bounds stronger. What you can have is higher knot strengths. So that's something like, you say, the SA stuff is branded as having 33%, I think it is, higher wet knot strength. It's kind of hard to test precisely, but it could very well be plausibly true, because a lot of lines are copolymers, meaning they blend together different things. They put coatings of different materials on. So they may, when they slick down to a knot, retain more strength, but their starting tensile strength is going to be fairly similar. So if somebody says this line is leaps and bounds stronger than the next, it's probably not completely true. Pay attention to your diameters. If you really want to get nerdy, you can get a micrometer, but you're probably good just trusting to some extent the labeled things.
Yeah. So as you can tell, we can get pretty dialed in and pretty focused on stuff and get pretty nerdy with it. So yeah, it can be a little much times, but this is going to help you in the long run understand what you're doing as well. So it may seem like sort of a rambling talk, but this is like really harder lessons from some of the best anglers that we know, just studying stuff out there as well and being critical of what we're doing to find better success on the water. So lots of information. It may seem like rambling into stuff, but really this is like some of the bread and butter stuff that's taken us years and years and years to figure out, which makes an entirely massive difference out there.
It is a little rambling because we can't.
Yeah.
Cool. So I don't know. I think that covers it for tippets. Would you agree, Rob?
Yeah. Well, yes. I think we can move on from there. We're pretty good. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we said we wanted to keep this relatively short, and here we are coming up on an hour again. Yeah. So flies. Marco asked about flies, and obviously we can't have this talk without flies. So the great thing for any trout anglers in the audience, I suspect there's more than a few, is that your trout box is very relevant. So you don't need to tie a whole new box or buy a whole new box worth of flies for this. However, there will, of course, be a few patterns that may vary. So I've got one of my Steelhead boxes here. Has a bunch of my more traditional, kind of bigger stuff. Some nymphs in here, admittedly, that aren't really Euro. They're more indicator style things. But then you'll see all the eggs and worms and stuff. And then I also carry with me on the river my trout box. So flies falling out of it here. So all my just standard trout nymphs here. You can go surprisingly big. You can go surprisingly small for these fish. What you will find is that you'll have to bump up the size of beads that you would use from your standard trout fishing just a bit. And one great thing is that most of our steelhead rivers, not all to make sure the rigs, but the great majority allow us to fish multiple fly rigs. I wouldn't recommend 3 or 4 flies as sometimes we're allowed to do, because that's just a whole mess and get foul fish and it's gonna be nightmarish. But 2 flies allows you to bundle a little more weight in your setup. So that's a good way, just because our steelhead rivers are bigger and those slightly thicker diameter tippets from what we would be fishing for trout are going to sink slightly slower. Great way to help get down. But that's the real key, is that because we're using 4x, 5x tippet here, you're going to need to bump up slightly to get similar results to what you would from regular fishing. So 3 mil, very much on the light side, but certainly well worth having in the box for low water conditions. 3.5, even 4 mil beads are going to be very relevant for a lot of conditions. Rob, you're itching to show something off there.
Oh yeah, exactly. When I was on the river the other day with Chris and our friend Dan there, like that's, I'm not sure how well that shows up right there, but that's a very simple hare's ear pattern. It's a slotted tungsten bead. I think that's a rose gold one or a silver. Will do just fine. That's standard hare's ear dubbing. A bit of, I think, a bit of orange seal fur in there, just because it was on my table and kind of got mixed in by accident, and just a generic tail, a bar tail. That's a Hannock hook. I forget exactly which model it is, but super.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Mitch, to answer your question, do you bump size up from what your trout bread and butter would be? Not really, no. And that may sound weird considering size of the fish, what they're used to eating in the lake, and the size of the water. But no, I was out a few weeks ago now doing this. Again, had a really good day out there. Top producing fly was a size 16 hare's ear. With a 3 mil bead on it. It was lights out. And I know Eric, again, who's at the shop, been trying this a good bit. His #1 fly has been a size 16 hare's ear. These fish will eat small stuff, especially if you have the clear water. It's not to say you shouldn't carry some bigger stuff. Fish will absolutely eat. Actually, I haven't really cranked out a whole bunch of like really big stones, but again, here's your more traditional sort of indicator style fly. They'll eat big stone flies, and so you can carry some of those in your box, but generally you're not going to need it a whole lot. And those bigger flies, similar to the tippet, are going to sink slower compared to your smaller flies. Strange as, again, that may sound. So yeah, going really small. It's a little size 14 Frenchie there. It's been really, really good for me. So no, you don't need to bump things up a lot compared to your normal stuff. And again, that's why you're going to carry your trout box, because these things, for one, nobody's really fishing them as it is. I realize that some people might get a little annoyed with us because we're kind of just advertising it, but don't be afraid to fish some really surprisingly small stuff. You'll be pleased with the results, especially when everyone else is fishing big eggs and worms and stuff like that.
There was a very well-known guide and angler, Ian Colin James, who was famous for going out to the mouth of rivers and creeks, It's a fly called the Ian's brass ass, which you can tie quite small, and he would cast it out into the mouths of rivers. And he would actually do extremely well catching a ton of fish. And these fish are cruising the shorelines when they come in, and they're eating bugs then as well. Lots of brown trout actually off the shorelines are coming to eat bugs too, and probably eating bugs in the lake as they emerge off the bottom. So it's not foreign to them eating small stuff. Even though they are big predators out there, they eat the big stuff. Like, why would they give up a small little snack along the way too? And those things are around all day long. Minnows will flee, or baitfish will flee, but those bugs are coming straight down at them. So that's a pretty easy meal.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we talk about sometimes in a more general context with steelhead, when steelhead come into the lake, come into the rivers, they're used to being in this like giant ocean of water, inland ocean, Great Lakes sense. And so when they come into a 20-foot wide creek, and they can be seen from all angles, they're really skittish. And so big stuff can sometimes put them down, and you're very unlikely to spook a fish with a small fly. So again, play it by ear with relation to water conditions, clarity and all that. But you can go pretty small. That said, carry some bigger stuff for when the water is up. So squirmy worms, always great. Egg flies, like the eggs to sea eggs, are really, really good. This is basically just eggs to sea yarn, which is like yarn chenille, essentially, wrapped on a hook with a bead head. Those things are lights out, super simple, good higher water patterns. If anyone wants to see some of these patterns being tied, again, Ian is doing a steelhead specific Euronymphing fly tying course with us early December. You could sign up's not open yet, but it will be in a couple weeks time. And then Clint next week is going to be tying some of his favorite flies for out west, which he regularly does catch steelhead on too. So those will be really good. Marco, your question, are medium wire hooks such as the Hannock 450s fine? Yes. All the hooks that I've been fishing for these things have been Law 450s, 470s, like the Jig Wave too, 230s, which is their standard nymph hook. These are just standard trout hooks. They work fine. Nice thing about the rods, again, is because they're designed to actually fish these hooks, they aren't capable of exerting so much force that you're going to easily bend these things out. I will admit, I've bent a couple hooks out, but not a ton. You can tie on really heavy wire stuff if you really want to, but you're not going to bend out a whole lot of hooks. So I wouldn't be super concerned about that.
Issue with the very thick wire hooks too is when you go for a hook set, you have to apply more force to get that hook embedded as well. So the thinner the diameter of hook, the easier the penetration is going to slide into his fish's mouth, much easier. Yeah. So of course, you talk about two flies there. I will say that I really do enjoy fishing one fly more than two. For me, I find it presented just way better, less chance of opposing currents affecting a fly, less chance of getting that second fly wrapped in these larger fish too. So I really do focus, for myself anyways, my preference is fishing a single fly, and I find I fish it better for me anyways.
One thing I realized we didn't talk about off the top as well is maybe just a word of caution. And this is going to be even more of a thing in the spring, but certainly in the fall too, is be really careful if you get to big holding pools, especially where you've got you see this out east a lot, where you see just a big pool and it'll just be black with fish. There's just a whole lot of fish swimming around, because at that point you have an angled line through the water. You've got a pretty solid chance of at some point catching a fin, catching a tail unintentionally, and foul hooking a fish. So be really careful. If you're going to fish that kind of water, fish a really light fly that's going to stay well above their heads. In the spring, fish are eating emerging bugs all the time, so they'll come up and grab something. Be careful if you're fishing like a big holding pool. That's the one area where I would say you've got to watch it in relation to the foul hooking chances here.
If you're in there too and you're catching, having a banner day catching as well, the pool stacked full of fish. Once we get considering the mortality rate with catch and release too, maybe consider just moving on for a while as well. So giving it a break. You don't need to catch every single fish in that pool. You don't have to. Go find some other fish, have fun somewhere else. Just kind of give those fish a break, and a fighting chance as well. So a lot of the ethical side are coming out there too.
Yeah, and to add to the ethical thing, obviously don't fish on reds. I feel like as this gets more popular, and that's again part of the reason we want to do this talk, is because this was kind of coming down the pike anyway, and people are going to be doing this. We just wanted to address all this up front, but it will be tempting, as it is for a lot of anglers to fish for fish on reds or on their spawning beds. If you're not familiar with the concept, come spring when they start spawning, a lot of us have had the opportunity to, say, on the ground or the credit, sight fish potentially to a fish that might be holding in a riffle or something. When you're talking about the spawning fish, they're vulnerable fish. They're, really too easy picking from an ethics perspective, but also you're interrupting that vital spawning process. And even if you're just sight fishing these fish and they're so focused on the spawning that they're not vulnerable and willing to eat and fly, if you enough casts over the fish in a very specific spot, you're gonna, again, floss it or foul hook it. So please do not use this as an excuse to go do that. We shouldn't really be sight fishing for steelhead. That's not typically a real effective or ethical way to go about this. So just throw that out there. I know it's a little boring to hear us ranting about ethics, but
well, that's fair enough. Actually, there's a video, the video on the New Fly Fisher that I was on, that brown trout, it was sitting in super clear water. I sight fished to that fish, and you could see the fish move off to the side and grab the fly as well. So I would, if that fish wasn't going to take a bunch of casts, maybe half dozen casts or dozen casts, I would have moved on knowing that fish wasn't playing. Because you can just again and again put a fly near it, eventually hook something on the fish. I would start, if you do see fish, maybe put the fly a little further away, let the fish come to the fly versus try and put it right into its mouth and all that. That's not what I'm about anyway. So
There, to be fair, there might be some times where sight fishing is more plausible, where especially fall fishing, where fish we're not concerned about them being on reds. Again, I would avoid very repetitive casts directly to the fish, but maybe it's just a clear water day and you do see some fish in a run or something. That's a very good point. Fish will move to eat. You don't need to put on their nose. If they aren't eating when it's on their nose, they're just not eating. So be cognizant of that. This is, these are risks and unfortunate realities of people fishing that we see no matter what the technique is. I don't think that these are potential new issues. Like, people do this with center pins, people do it with fly gear, people do it with every single technique. So, I'm sure, unfortunately, there will be some people who use this as another excuse to do unfortunate, unethical things. But as long as you go into it with a good head, I think you're just fine.
Yeah, cool. We can talk about on the, I guess to move things along here, is the versatility of your setup as well. So it's not just a Euronymphing rig, you can do other things with it too. My second fish of the day on Monday was on a streamer using a Euronymphing rod with a Euronymphing setup too. I changed my terminal tippet out to a heavier tippet strength, so it was 8 pound at that point. And I was able to cast exactly this fly, which was the Godzilla sculpin. I love this fly to death. I hooked a steelhead on this for fly, a black one, on the Yakima River some years ago, and it was the first steelhead hooked in a long time. I lost it very quickly. Mind you, it was on very light trout tippet and a very fast river. But you can also change your Euronymphing setup to be a streamer rod very quickly and put on a heavier weight of fly, jig it behind rocks, put it into the heads of pools and rip it back towards you as well. So you're not just stuck with nymphing. You can always change things up too. If you have a small, if you want to cast, say behind a rock, you can't drift very well. It's a little too far away, you can't approach it, but you can actually slip on an indicator onto your rig as well, and then flick that out, get the indicator on the other side of the rock or obstruction, and then drift your presentation behind that too. So you can always use a suspension device like an indicator, a bobber, to get a vertical presentation to reach the place that you can't as well. So don't be stuck with just Euronymphing. You can also do different things with this stuff as well. Just change your setup a little bit, adapt it, and you're rocking.
Yeah, and that'll absolutely be necessary, if not even just 2 rods, if you really want to fish some rivers very well. Obviously, you don't have to have that, multiple setups for every river, but there's some situations where this just will not work all that well. So thinking of especially bigger rivers, or just rivers where you have very slow flows and the river's decently wide, like this would be frankly not very effective on large sections of the Nottawasaga, of the Saugeen, of, not that Grand is a great nymphing river anyways, but on there, even places in the Credit where frankly this wouldn't be super effective. So you do have to kind of pick and choose. If you find those really deep tanky spots or really slow waters, it's probably not that you can't do it, it's just not going to work as well as it would in other situations where you have some speed, some even flows, some runs, some riffles, and where you can get relatively close to the fish in those deeper, tankier runs. Indicators, frankly, still the way to go. This isn't going to revolutionize every aspect of steelheading. You still need to be versatile.
Great point. Cool. Any questions, guys? You can drop them in there. A bit more to talk about, but definitely ending sort of getting towards the end of the presentation, I think. But if you have any questions, please drop them there so we can work towards them. We're just that good, Chris. No questions. We're solid. Woo!
Even Patrick's here and he's not asking questions. That's
yeah. Oh, he will. Get ready.
He's got physics exams on the mind. I have the long version of Echo's Carbon XL on a 3-weight that I tightline with, but that was Chris's example of a narrow butt rod. The long version, I assume you mean the Euronymphing version, Mitch. They make that carbon. Yeah, my example, funny enough, was the Carbon XL. But to be clear, this is the 7-foot 6-inch version. This is like their little bush rod. This is not their Euro rod. That rod will work just fine. Yeah, that's the 10-footer. It'll have that similarly stout butt section. No issue there. And to reiterate again, we do not assert that anyone is not going to break a rod doing this.
Disclaimer.
Yeah, and you're pushing it, so you accept the risk of breaking something. It's not going to be a warranty thing if you break a rod doing this kind of thing. You're pushing the limits with it, but if you're willing to give it a go, I think you'll probably find some pretty good results with it. Feel like yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think that covers all the questions we got. Of course, if you as this stews in your brain, have any additional questions that come up, or because we're going to post this to YouTube as well, for what I'm sure will be many other people watching it down the line. If anyone has questions, you can reach us at the shop. Cool.
Right on. Any closing remarks, Chris? Any last thoughts?
No, that's about all I got. Good luck to anyone trying it. It works really well. Be patient. You're probably gonna bust off a few fish getting going, but in the long run, I think this will work very, very nicely for everybody. So yeah, give it a go and let us know what you think.
Yep. And my little points here just to finish things off is definitely train up to this. Don't go out there just assuming you can land a fish in your first day Euronymphing. It's going to be a disaster if you do. I can 100% guarantee you that. So train up to it. Ethical behavior on the water too. If you get to the point where you do feel that little inkling, this is going on for a bit too long, it's already too long, break that fish off. Don't be afraid that barbless hook, please fish barbless, will pop right out and the fish will go back and hang out. Just get on the water, have fun, try it out, and then try new things. And there's been amazing fishing this year for steelhead. So don't wait to go on the water, just go on the water, get a day off. If you have kids, I don't know, buy somebody, look after, rent somebody, a babysitter, I think that's what they call them. So I get that. If you have a dog you have to look after, then find a dog sitter as well. Get out there, just get on the water and fish. It's the season's not going to last long. We've had 20-degree weather in November, 2 years in a row. Crazy, insanely awesome days. They're super enjoyable. Get the heck out there and have a fantastic time.
Awesome. Well said. And don't be scared. I know we've had some low water this last week. Suddenly all that rain ended for some reason that we've had all season. But this technique actually probably excels most when you have low, clear water, just because those small flies are, again, something nobody else is fishing, and you're able to really target like pocket water and stuff really well. Even this week, even though I know we've heard some folks, complaining that it's been low water, don't be afraid to try this, because this is really where this excels.
Cool. Right on. Well, everyone have a great night. This will be posted up on the YouTube very shortly for your reference. Any questions, as Chris said, just call us at the shop. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Come down to the shop and hang out and get a few flies. They're on sale.
All right. Have a good night, guys.
Bye.